somewhere in the high desert of northern Arizona, carved into a slab of sandstone that's been sitting in the same spot for who knows how long, there's a set of lines and symbols that some people believe map out the entire future of humanity. Not metaphorically, literally, a stone timeline showing where we came from, where we are, and where we're headed next. And according to some interpretations, we are standing right now at the exact point on that rock where everything could go one of two ways. That's a massive claim. A single petroglyph pecked into rock by human hands centuries ago, somehow anticipating the specific anxieties of the 21st century. Nuclear weapons, climate collapse, technology outpacing wisdom. It sounds almost too perfect, doesn't it? Like something designed for a viral post, rather than something carved by people trying to record their understanding of the world. So that's exactly the question we're going to dig into. Is the Hopi Prophecy Rock genuinely a piece of ancient warning passed down through generations, encoded in symbols that predate contact with European settlers? Or is it something else entirely? A symbol whose meaning has been reshaped, reinterpreted, and in some cases outright invented by outsiders looking for something, anything, that confirms their fears about where the modern world is heading. Here's the thing. Both of those possibilities can be true at the same time, and that's what makes this story so much more interesting than a simple yes or no. There's a real petroglyph. There's a real Hopi history behind it, one that stretches back through migrations, oral teachings, and a worldview that doesn't separate the past from the present the way modern Western thinking tends to. And there's also, undeniably, a modern layer built on top of all that. Cold War anxieties, New Age spirituality, documentary crews, and decades of retelling that have shaped how this rock gets talked about today. Our job in the next little while is to pull those threads apart carefully. We're going to look at what the rock actually shows, what Hopi voices themselves have said publicly about its meaning, how outsiders first encountered it and ran with the story, and where the evidence gets solid versus where it turns into speculation dressed up as certainty. No exaggeration needed, no dramatic embellishment required. Just an honest walk through one of the strangest, most debated pieces of American folklore. Because honestly, the real story is stranger and more layered than most of what gets repeated online. Before we go further, I want to know where you're listening from right now. Drop a comment and tell me your city and what time it is where you are. I read these things and it's genuinely wild seeing the pattern. Someone in Manila getting ready for their morning coffee while someone in Toronto is finally drifting off to sleep. All listening to the same story about a rock in the Arizona desert at the exact same moment. There's something oddly comforting about that, a tiny thread connecting all of us, no matter the time zone. And if you're enjoying these deep dives, the best way to support what we're doing here is simple. Follow the show on Spotify. Listen there when you can. And if you feel like it's earned a moment of your time, leave a 5-star review. It costs nothing. It takes about 10 seconds, and it genuinely helps more people find these stories. There's a link in the description that'll take you straight there. Alright, let's get into it. Let's talk about what this rock actually is, where it sits, what it shows, and why a single flat stone in the desert became one of the most quoted, most misunderstood pieces of prophecy in the world. So let's start with the basics. What are we actually looking at when someone shows you an image of the Hopi Prophecy Rock? Physically, it's a slab of sandstone sitting out in the open desert of northeastern Arizona, not far from the Hopi mesas. The ancient villages perched on top of these dramatic rock formations that have been continuously inhabited for something like 1,000 years, maybe longer. This isn't a rock hidden away in a museum vault or locked behind glass somewhere. It's outdoors, exposed to wind and sun and rain, sitting in a landscape that hasn't changed all that much in centuries. And carved into its surface is a series of lines, figures, and shapes that most people who've seen the photographs would recognize instantly, even if they couldn't tell you what any of it means. Here's the first thing that needs to be said clearly, though, because it gets lost constantly in how this rock gets talked about online. This is a petroglyph. It's an image pecked into stone using stone tools, the same basic technique used to create thousands of other petroglyphs across the American Southwest. It is not a written document. It's not a page torn out of some ancient book with footnotes and a title. There's no caption chiseled next to it that says, "Here is exactly what this line means, and here's the date this was carved, and here's who carved it." What we have is a diagram, a visual representation of ideas, and diagrams like that require interpretation. They always have. That's true of petroglyphs generally, and it's especially true of this one. So what does the image actually show? Let's walk through the elements that show up again and again in photographs and descriptions, because even though the details vary depending on which version you're looking at, there's a core set of features that most renderings agree on. At the center, there's a human figure, simple, stick-like, the kind of humanoid shape you see in rock art traditions all over the world. This figure is usually described as representing a kind of universal human being, sometimes interpreted as representing the Hopi people specifically, sometimes interpreted more broadly as representing humanity as a whole standing at a point of decision. From this figure, lines extend outward and eventually split. This is the detail that gets the most attention, because it's the part that looks, at least visually, like a fork in the road. One path splits into what appear to be two possible futures, sometimes shown as two separate lines running in different directions, sometimes shown with additional smaller marks along each path that people have interpreted as representing different stages of technological or spiritual development. There are also circles, multiple circles actually, appearing at different points along the lines. In many interpretations, these circles are read as markers of time. Some describe them as representing eras or great ages that humanity passes through. Others read them more specifically as representing celestial bodies, meaning the sun, or cyclical events tied to Hopi understanding of time and renewal. And then there's what people usually call the lower line or the lower path, a line running beneath the main figure and its branching roots, sometimes shown running parallel to the upper lines, sometimes shown intersecting with them at certain points. This lower line has become central to a lot of the popular interpretations of the rock, the ones that talk about a path of purification, or a path that leads through hardship and struggle before eventually reconnecting with the corn. The more grounded and traditional way of life the Hopi have always associated with survival and balance. Now, here's where things get genuinely tricky, and it's worth sitting with this for a second instead of rushing past it. If you go looking for images of this rock right now, you will find versions that don't match each other. Not wildly different, but different enough to matter. Some versions show additional smaller figures near the base of the lines that other versions leave out entirely. Some redrawings include labels in English, words like corn or path or great day of purification written directly onto the diagram, labels that obviously were not carved into the original stone by hand a century ago. Some versions are rotated compared to others, drawn as though you're looking at the rock from a different angle, which changes how the branching paths appear to flow, left to right versus right to left, upward versus downward. Why does this happen? A few reasons, and none of them require any kind of conspiracy to explain. First, photographing petroglyphs is genuinely difficult. Lighting conditions change dramatically depending on the time of day and the angle of the sun, and shallow carvings that are barely visible at noon can look completely different, sometimes dramatically clearer, in the long shadows of early morning or late afternoon. A photograph taken at 10 in the morning might barely show half the lines that show up in a photograph taken at 6 in the evening. Second, redrawings, the hand-traced versions that get published in books and articles, are inherently interpretive. Whoever traces the image is making decisions about which marks are intentional carving and which are just natural erosion, cracks, or weathering in the stone. Different people tracing the same surface will sometimes make different calls. And third, and maybe most importantly, once labels and captions get added to a diagram, whether by researchers, by authors writing books about Hopi prophecy for a general audience, or by random accounts online trying to make a compelling post, those labels start getting copied and recopied as if they were part of the original carving. After enough repetition, people stop questioning where the label came from. It just becomes accepted as fact. So what we're left with is a real petroglyph, sitting in a real place, showing a genuinely striking set of images, a central figure, branching paths, circles, a lower line, but surrounded by decades of retelling that have added detail, added certainty, and added specificity that the stone itself simply doesn't provide on its own. And this brings us to the most important point of this whole section, the one that's going to guide everything else we talk about going forward. If you want to understand what this rock actually means, or at least what it has meant to the people whose land it sits on, you cannot get there through a caption on a photo shared 1,000 times online. You have to look at it through Hopi cultural context, through the oral traditions, the migration stories, and the concept of history that the Hopi people themselves have carried for generations. That context doesn't erase the mystery. If anything, it makes the whole thing richer and more complicated than the internet version ever lets on. But to get there, we first need to understand where the Hopi people actually come from, how their villages came to sit on top of these mesas in the first place, and why their sense of time and prophecy works so differently from the way most of us have been taught to think about the future. To understand that context, you have to begin with a place. Not an abstract place on a map, not the generic American Southwest of tourist brochures and old Western movies, but the high desert of northeastern Arizona, where 3 long sandstone mesas rise above a landscape of sagebrush, dry washes, open sky, and enormous distance. This is Hopi country, and for people who have lived there generation after generation, the land is not just the setting for a story. It is part of the story. The cliffs, springs, fields, clouds, trails, shrines, and village plazas are all tied into a way of understanding responsibility. You don't separate the spiritual world from the physical world, because the physical world is where those obligations are carried out. You plant, you pray, you care for relatives, you observe ceremonies. You remember what was handed down, and through those actions you help maintain balance in a world that is never guaranteed to remain balanced. The Hopi are among the indigenous peoples with the longest continuous connections to the Southwest. Their ancestral history reaches deep into the archaeological record and even deeper into oral traditions that describe migrations, emergence, settlement, loss, renewal, and the search for a place where life could be sustained in the right way. Archaeologists generally connect the Hopi to the broader ancestral Pueblo world, the network of farming communities that built villages, developed complex trade routes, and adapted to the demanding conditions of the Four Corners region and the Colorado Plateau over many centuries. But that phrase, ancestral Pueblo, can make this sound like a vanished civilization in a textbook. It wasn't. Communities changed, some moved, some joined other villages. Some places were abandoned as drought, conflict, resource pressure, and political change reshaped the region. But people remained, languages remained, ceremonies remained, relationships to particular places remained. The Hopi villages on the mesas are living communities, not ruins. Some have been continuously occupied for roughly 1,000 years, possibly longer depending on the village and how continuity is understood. That makes them among the oldest continuously inhabited settlements in North America. Picture what that means. While kingdoms rose and fell across Europe, while ships crossed the Atlantic, while the United States appeared, expanded, fought wars, drew borders, built railroads, and sent people to the moon. Families were still living on these mesas, still carrying water, still tending fields, still gathering for ceremonies in village plazas, still teaching children that survival in a dry country depends on more than individual effort. Because this is not easy land, rainfall is limited and unpredictable. A good year can bring enough moisture for corn to grow in dry fields below the mesas. A bad year can turn the ground hard, leave the washes empty, and force everyone to confront just how little control human beings have over the weather. The Hopi became extraordinarily skilled dry farmers, growing varieties of corn adapted over generations to short seasons, sandy soils, heat, wind, and long waits between rains. And corn in this world is not merely food, it is food, obviously. It is survival. It is stored against lean times. It is seed saved for the next planting. But it is also a relationship. Corn appears in Hopi ceremonial life, in teachings about emergence and migration, in understandings of health, continuity, and responsibility. The colours of corn can carry meaning. The act of planting can carry meaning. The ability to feed a family through careful work and respect for the land can carry meaning. That matters when people look at the Prophecy Rock and immediately see a doomsday chart. The popular version often turns everything into one enormous warning about the end of the world. Technology rises, humanity chooses the wrong road. Catastrophe arrives. The faithful survive. It is dramatic. It is clean. It fits the modern appetite for a countdown. But Hopi lifeways are not built around waiting for an apocalypse to happen. They are built around maintaining reciprocal obligations in the present. Reciprocity is one of the key ideas here. Rain does not simply belong to people. The land does not simply exist to be extracted from. Food does not appear because humans demand it. Life depends on relationships between people and families, villages and clans, the living and those who came before, human beings and the beings, forces and places that make life possible. Ceremony is part of that relationship. It is not performance. It is not entertainment, and it is not necessarily an encoded prediction intended for anyone with an internet connection to decode. This is where outsiders can get lost fast. They see a dry landscape and assume scarcity. They see ancient-looking villages and assume the people must be frozen in the past. They hear stories involving previous worlds, destruction, emergence, and purification, and they assume they have discovered an indigenous version of Revelation. Then they take a few public fragments, remove them from ceremony, language, landscape, and community, and turn them into a universal prophecy for everybody else. It is a familiar pattern. Complex traditions get compressed into a single sentence. They predicted us. And once that happens, every new crisis becomes proof. Nuclear weapons? The Hopi predicted it. Climate change? The Hopi predicted it. Artificial intelligence, satellites, social media, pandemics, drought, war. Somehow, people claim the stone saw all of it coming in advance. Maybe that tells us less about what Hopi teachings say than about what outsiders desperately want them to say. Because modern society is full of people who feel that something has gone wrong. The pace is too fast, the systems are too large, the technologies are too powerful. The consequences of decisions made in distant boardrooms can reach across oceans and generations. So when people encounter a petroglyph that appears to show a human figure standing at a branching path, they see themselves. They see the anxiety of their own moment reflected back from stone. But reflection is not the same thing as interpretation. Hopi knowledge is diverse. It is held in different ways by different villages, clans, societies, families, religious leaders, and individual people. There is no single master key that unlocks every teaching. There is no central office issuing official explanations for every symbol that appears in a photograph online. Some teachings have been shared publicly over the years. Some have been described by Hopi speakers in books, interviews, and public gatherings. Others are private, ceremonial, or restricted, and that boundary is not an obstacle to overcome. It is a boundary to respect. Think about it this way. Every culture has knowledge that is not meant for casual public consumption. Family histories, religious rites, private grief, the names people use among themselves. Things that gain their meaning precisely because they are carried with care in the right place by people who have accepted responsibility for them. Yet indigenous traditions are often treated differently. Outsiders assume that if something is old, sacred, or mysterious, it is theirs to interpret. If they can photograph it, quote it, or put it in a documentary, then it must be public property. That assumption has caused real harm. For generations, native communities have watched sacred objects collected, ceremonies recorded, stories simplified, and cultural knowledge sold back to the public as spiritual merchandise. In that history, humility is not just good manners. It is part of historical honesty. We can investigate what has been publicly shared. We can examine how the Prophecy Rock has been interpreted, reproduced, and transformed. We can ask what the symbols may mean in context, but we should not pretend that a YouTube video, a book, or an outsider's confident explanation can possess knowledge that communities themselves have chosen to protect. And there is another complication. The Hopi does not mean one identical voice speaking in perfect unison across every subject. Like every living people, Hopi communities include different generations, different perspectives, different levels of willingness to speak publicly, and different views about how outsiders should approach traditional teachings. Some Hopi individuals have shared prophetic messages openly, especially during the 20th century. Others have warned that those messages are routinely misunderstood, commercialized, or detached from the obligations that give them meaning. Both realities can be true at once. So, as we move deeper into the rock itself, we need to hold on to that tension. The image is compelling, the public interpretations are fascinating. The broader Hopi tradition offers ideas about migration, moral responsibility, balance, and the consequences of human choices that are far richer than the viral versions suggest. But this is not a treasure map to a secret indigenous prediction. It is not a license to turn a living culture into a backdrop for our fears. The mesas are still there, the villages are still there. Corn is still planted in a land where rain is never guaranteed. Ceremonies still continue, often beyond the view of outsiders. And that living continuity changes the question we should be asking. Not, did the Hopi predict exactly what would happen to us? But, what kind of world produces a teaching in which survival depends on remembering that humans are not separate from the land, from each other, or from the consequences of their choices? To get closer to that question, we have to go back to one of the deepest foundations of Hopi identity. The stories of how people emerged into this world, travelled across it, and learned that finding a home was never just about reaching a destination. In publicly shared Hopi accounts, the world people live in now is not the first world. It is often described as the fourth world, a world entered after earlier worlds ended because human beings lost their way. That idea is easy to flatten into a disaster story. A world becomes corrupt, a great destruction happens, the worthy escape. Then history starts over, but that is not really the point. The deeper point is responsibility. Each world gives people a chance to live correctly, to remember where life comes from, to respect the powers that sustain it, to care for one another, to avoid arrogance, greed, violence, and the belief that human beings can take without limit. And in the publicly told versions, each previous world eventually reached a moment when people forgot those obligations. They became divided. They turned away from spiritual guidance. They misused knowledge, they pursued power for its own sake. They treated the world as something to control rather than something to live within. And then that world ended. Exactly how these events are described can vary. That matters. Hopi teachings are not one single printed book with one official sequence of events, one universal translation, and one interpretation that every person must repeat in exactly the same words. Different public accounts emphasize different details. Some stories speak of destruction by fire, others speak of ice, floods, or the breaking apart of the world. Some accounts focus on the actions people took. Others focus on the spiritual help that made survival possible. The details are not interchangeable props for an apocalypse movie. They belong to a living tradition, carried differently in different communities. But across many of the accounts that have been shared publicly, a pattern appears. Human beings are given a world. They are given instruction. They are given the ability to choose. And when they abandon balance, the consequences become larger than any individual person can control. That is where emergence enters the story. The Hopi word, often translated as emergence, describes more than simply coming out of a hole in the ground. In public explanations, it is a passage from one condition of existence into another, a movement upward, a transformation, a beginning that follows crisis, but also carries the memory of what came before. In some widely shared versions, people emerged into this present world through an opening called a sipapu. Today, the sipapu has ceremonial significance, and its meaning cannot be reduced to one simple definition. But in the broadest public sense, it marks a connection, a reminder that this world was entered, not automatically inherited. People did not simply arrive as owners of the land. They emerged into a world where they would have to prove, through their conduct, that they could remain. Think about that for a moment. Modern societies often tell a different story. We are born into a world of resources. Rivers become water supply. Forests become lumber. Mountains become minerals. Animals become inventory. Land becomes property. And progress means extracting more, building faster, reaching farther. The emergence story starts from another premise. You are not above the world. You are entering it. You are dependent on it. And your right to live well depends on whether you can maintain the relationships that make life possible. But emerging was only the beginning. The people did not arrive in the fourth world, look around, and immediately settle wherever the soil seemed richest or the view seemed best. They migrated, and these migrations were not merely ancient population movements in the archaeological sense, though they also involved real travel across real landscapes. They were spiritual journeys, tests of patience, discipline, memory, and obedience to instruction. Clans travelled in different directions. They crossed deserts, rivers, mountains, and plains. They encountered other peoples, they established places, left places, and carried responsibilities from one generation to the next. In some public Hopi teachings, the migrations were guided by signs. A clan might be told where to travel, what to look for, where to pause, and when to continue. The journey itself created the map. Places became meaningful because people had passed through them, prayed there, struggled there, received something there, or made commitments there. This is one reason the Southwest cannot be understood as an empty stage awaiting settlement. It is full of remembered movement. Trails are not just routes between points on a modern map. Springs, mesas, ruins, shrines, fields, and distant landmarks can carry layers of history and obligation. And the final destination was not simply a reward. It was a place of responsibility. In widely shared accounts, the Hopi eventually came to the mesas under the guidance, or authority, of Masor, often described in English as Masor, Masawu, or the Great Spirit of Death. English labels can be misleading here. Masor is not easily squeezed into a familiar Western category like God, Devil, King, or Ghost. Public descriptions often portray him as a guardian or caretaker of the earth, a figure connected with death, the underworld, humility, and the rules human beings must follow if they are to remain in the world. And here is the part that feels almost backwards by modern standards. Masor is often associated not with wealth, comfort, or conquest, but with humility. In some public retellings, when the people arrived, they were offered different choices. A life of ease, a life of power, a life that looked impressive. But the Hopi accepted the hard path, dry farming, difficult land, a demanding climate, and the obligation to live simply. Not because hardship is automatically sacred, not because suffering is romantic, but because the choice represented something. A refusal to place material abundance above the duties that hold a community together. The Mesas were not a prize for being stronger than everyone else. They were a covenant. Live with restraint, maintain ceremony, care for the land, keep faith with the instructions. Do not forget that survival is collective. That is why migration matters so much in this tradition. It is not just the story of how one people got from point A to point B. It is the story of how people learn, through movement and hardship, that home is not something you possess. Home is something you continually earn through right relationship. And that brings us closer to the Prophecy Rock. In popular retellings, the rock is often presented as a standalone message, almost like an ancient billboard warning modern humanity about technology, war, and a coming collapse. But many people who discuss it place it within this much larger moral history, the movement through previous worlds, the emergence into the present one, the long migrations, and the constant possibility that human beings can lose balance again. The rock in that reading is not primarily saying, here is a secret calendar. Here is the exact year everything ends. It is asking a far older question. What happens when people forget why they are here? The answer, according to the pattern of the earlier worlds, is not necessarily one fixed prediction. It is a warning about consequences. When greed becomes normal. When power is treated as wisdom. When people ignore the limits of land, water, and community. When they stop listening to the responsibilities that made their survival possible in the first place. Then the path becomes dangerous, and perhaps that is why the image of a path matters so much. Before there is a fork in the road, before there are lines climbing upward or breaking away, there is the larger story behind them. People emerge into a world, travel across it, receive instruction, and face the same test again and again. Will they live as though the world belongs to them? Or will they live as though they belong to the world? So now look at the figure in the centre. At first glance, it seems almost too simple to carry the weight people place on it. A human form, arms extended, lines moving around it, above it, away from it. No long inscription, no obvious date, no sentence saying, "This is what will happen in the year 2026. Just a figure standing at a crossing of meanings. In many popular readings, that central figure represents the Hopi people. In others, it represents humanity as a whole. And those two interpretations are not necessarily in conflict. The Hopi are speaking from their own land, their own ceremonies, their own history, and their own responsibilities. But the warning often associated with the image concerns a problem that does not stop at the edge of any one village, nation, or continent. What kind of people are we becoming? That is the question the figure seems to force us to ask. It stands there not as a king, not as a conqueror, not as a machine operator, not as someone rising above the earth. It is simply human, small, exposed, dependent, a person in relation to paths that were already there and paths that may continue long after that person is gone. That matters because modern viewers often approach ancient symbols looking for predictions. We want the image to tell us what comes next. We want to know whether the figure is pointing to a war, a flood, an earthquake, a technological collapse, or some final moment on a hidden calendar. But a different reading begins somewhere else. Not, what date does this image predict? But, what obligations does this image place on the people who see it? The vertical line connected with the central figure is frequently described in public discussions as the life path or the spiritual path. Depending on the source, it may be understood as the proper road, the path of balance, the route of spiritual continuity, or the line along which people remain connected to the instructions that allowed them to live in this world. It is tempting to imagine it as a timeline. The line goes up, so history moves forward. The circles along it must be years, ages, inventions, wars, or future events waiting to unfold. And that is exactly where many modern interpretations begin. But a straight line does not automatically mean a calendar. In Hopi-centered public explanations, the deeper emphasis is often not on counting time. It is on maintaining a way of life. The path is not important because it tells you what year comes next. It is important because it asks whether people remain on it. Think of the difference. A timeline is passive. Events happen. You move through them. One year becomes another, whether you understand anything or not. A path is different. A path requires walking. It requires attention. It can be followed, neglected, abandoned, or returned to. It involves decisions. It has consequences. And if you lose it, the problem is not that the map was wrong. The problem is that you stopped paying attention to where you were going. That is why the image can feel so unsettling. The central figure is not merely observing the paths. It appears bound up with them. Humanity is not standing outside the moral order of the world, watching from a safe distance. Humanity is inside it. Every choice affects the route ahead. And then there are the circles, or enclosed shapes. These are among the most discussed elements of the Prophecy Rock, and also among the easiest to overinterpret. Depending on the version of the image being circulated, the shapes may be presented as circles, loops, enclosures, or marked points along the lines. Popular writers have connected them to previous worlds, stages of human history, migrations, villages, places of testing, ceremonial events, or decisive moments when people must choose one direction rather than another. Some readers see the circles as worlds. That interpretation fits, at least broadly, with the publicly shared Hopi teaching that human beings pass through earlier worlds before entering the present fourth world. Others see them as settlements or stopping places along the migrations. That also makes a certain kind of sense. The migration stories are full of movement, pauses, signs, trials, and places where human beings had to remember the instructions they had been given. Others treat the enclosed forms as warnings, moments when a path becomes closed off, moments when people become trapped by their own actions, moments when one era ends and another begins. And then there are the interpretations that claim the circles correspond to exact historical developments: railroads, world wars, electrical power, industrial expansion, space travel, and the rise of machines. Those readings are everywhere. They are dramatic. They are memorable. And once you have seen a chart that labels each symbol with a modern event, it can be hard to look at the rock without seeing the labels too. But this is where caution becomes essential. The labels are usually modern additions. They do not come carved into the stone. The rock does not include a legend in English telling us, this circle means airplanes, or this line marks the internet, or this symbol proves the present year is the final warning. A viewer may see a shape that resembles a technological object. Another viewer may see a village. Another may see a spiritual boundary. Another may see an ordinary part of a larger design whose full meaning is not meant for public explanation at all. And that uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It may be one of the story's most important facts. We are used to believing that knowledge is real only when it can be extracted, translated, labelled, and turned into a diagram. But living traditions do not always work like that. Some knowledge is contextual, some belongs to ceremony, some depends on language, place, family, and responsibility. Some is shared publicly only in part, and some interpretations that have become famous outside Hopi communities may say more about the fears of the outsiders repeating them than about the original meaning of the image. So when someone claims to possess the one true master key to every mark on the Prophecy Rock, that claim should make us pause, because no single universal key has been publicly verified for every symbol. There are widely repeated interpretations. There are accounts shared by particular Hopi individuals. There are books, lectures, museum discussions, websites, documentaries, and generations of outsiders trying to decode the image. But there is no universally accepted public chart that settles every line and circle beyond question. That does not mean the rock means nothing. It means it may mean more than a code. Look again at the central human figure. If the figure represents humanity, then the image is not asking us to become expert fortune tellers. It is asking us to become responsible participants. The line called the life path is not necessarily telling us when the next crisis arrives. It is asking whether we recognize the conditions that create crisis in the first place. Loss of balance, forgetting obligation, treating land as a resource without limits, treating other people as obstacles, mistaking speed for wisdom, mistaking power for safety. The circles may be worlds. They may be villages, they may be stages, they may be moments of passage. But in nearly every broad reading, they suggest continuity. Life does not begin with us. Our choices do not end with us. We move through conditions created by those before us, and we leave conditions for those who come after. That is a much more demanding message than a prediction. A prediction lets you wait for the future. A path demands that you walk differently now. And on the Prophecy Rock, the path does not remain single forever. At some point, the lines divide. One route continues. Another turns away. That fork is where the mystery becomes a warning. And that fork is where the image becomes almost impossible to ignore. Because a fork is not just another mark on a stone. A fork means that one road is no longer enough. Something has changed. A decision has appeared. The traveller cannot keep moving forward in exactly the same way and still claim there was no choice involved. One line continues along the direction already established. Another breaks away. And in the popular reading of the Hopi Prophecy Rock, that break is the central drama of the entire image. The common interpretation is simple enough to understand in a few seconds. One path is the path of balance, a life lived with humility, restraint, ceremony, responsibility, and respect for the land. It is often described as the traditional path, though that phrase can be misleading if we imagine it means merely copying the past. In this reading, tradition is not nostalgia, it is a discipline. A set of obligations that keeps human beings from forgetting that they depend on water, soil, animals, weather, community, and forces beyond their control. The other path is usually described in much darker terms. It is the road of materialism, the road of speed, the road of machines, extraction, conflict, consumption, and separation from the natural world. On popular diagrams, this branching line is sometimes linked to industrial society, global war, technological power, and an expanding hunger for more. More energy, more territory, more goods, more control, more growth, even when the land is telling us that more is becoming too much. It is an interpretation that feels startlingly modern. And that is exactly why it spread so widely. Look at the last 2 centuries. Coal pulled from the ground on an enormous scale, forests cut faster than they can regrow, rivers redirected, cities spreading across farmland, weapons capable of killing millions, a global economy built around producing, shipping, buying, discarding, and producing again. Technologies that connect people across the planet while often leaving them more isolated from the places where they actually live. When viewers see a line turning away from the life path, it is easy to believe they are looking at a map of all of this. But easy is not the same as certain. The rock itself does not come with a caption saying, "This branch represents factories," or "This mark refers to nuclear weapons," or "This is the internet, this is climate change, and this is the exact year humanity reaches the point of no return." Those are interpretations layered onto the image, often by people trying to connect Hopi teachings to the crises of their own time. And that does not automatically make them worthless. Symbols survive because they can speak across generations. A warning about imbalance can apply to a society powered by steam engines, a society powered by oil, or a society powered by algorithms. The details change, the moral problem may not. But we have to be honest about the difference between what is carved, what has been shared in public Hopi teachings, and what later audiences have added because they were looking for themselves in the stone. The branching line may be understood as 2 roads, but it may also carry several meanings at once. It can be warning, a warning that human beings can abandon the responsibilities that keep life in balance. A warning that power without restraint does not make a people secure. A warning that when people treat the earth as dead matter, they eventually discover that they have wounded the systems keeping them alive. It can be instruction, not an instruction manual with numbered steps, but a moral direction. Remember where you came from. Remember what you owe. Do not confuse possession with belonging. Do not let convenience replace responsibility. Do not let the ability to do something persuade you that it should be done. And it can be memory, a memory of earlier turns, earlier migrations, earlier worlds according to publicly shared Hopi teachings, earlier moments when people failed to live properly and face the consequences. In that sense, the fork may not only be about some distant future catastrophe, it may be about a pattern human beings have encountered before. That changes the entire meaning of the image, because if the fork is only a prediction, then we are spectators. We stand at a distance, staring at the stone, asking which disaster will arrive first. Will it be war, drought, fire, flood, economic collapse? A technological disaster? We wait for the prophecy to prove itself, as if the main purpose of wisdom is to give us advance notice of our own downfall. But if the fork is instruction, then we are not spectators. We are the people standing at it. And if the fork is memory, then the question becomes even more uncomfortable. How many times have people already been warned? How often have communities seen the signs of imbalance and chosen not to change because change was inconvenient, expensive, or politically impossible? A fork does not guarantee that one road ends in destruction. It means that roads lead somewhere different. That distinction matters. Modern prophecy culture often turns every warning into a countdown. A branching line becomes proof that catastrophe is scheduled. Every crisis becomes a sign that the final point has arrived. Every year is announced as the year the prophecy is fulfilled at last. But that is not how a moral warning works. A moral warning is conditional. If you continue in one direction, certain consequences follow. If you change direction, other possibilities remain open. The warning has urgency precisely because the outcome is not yet fixed. If nothing could be changed, there would be no reason to warn anyone. Think about a sign beside a mountain road. It says, "Bridge out ahead." The sign is not predicting that every driver will plunge into the canyon. It is telling them to slow down, pay attention, and choose differently before the point where choosing becomes impossible. That may be the deepest power of the fork on the Prophecy Rock. It does not offer the comfort of certainty. It does not tell us that someone else will save us, that the future has already been written, or that history is a machine moving toward an unavoidable ending. Instead, it puts responsibility back where people least want it. With us, the popular reading places the balanced path beside the path of disruption. But perhaps the point is not that one side belongs to ancient people and the other belongs to modern people. Perhaps both paths exist in every society, every community, every family, every individual. One path asks what can be taken, the other asks what must be protected. One path values immediate gain, the other considers children not yet born. One path sees land as inventory, the other sees relationship. And that is why trying to date the fork may miss the point. Exactly where are we now is a gripping question. It makes the image feel like a cosmic GPS coordinate, with humanity racing toward a marked destination. But the stone may be asking a harder question. Not where are we on the line? Which line are we feeding with our choices? Because the future, in this reading, is not hidden somewhere ahead of us. It is being made at the crossroads, and this is where the lower line enters the story. On many widely circulated versions of the Hopi Prophecy Rock diagram, a line runs beneath the main life path. It is sometimes drawn as a separate route. Sometimes it is linked to symbols said to represent upheaval, conflict, or a final period of cleansing. And in popular retellings, this lower route is often called the path of the Great Purification. That phrase has enormous power. It sounds like the final chapter of a disaster movie. A time when the world is violently swept clean, a moment of fire, war, famine, disease, flood, or earth-shaking catastrophe that destroys the old order and leaves only a few survivors behind. And once that idea takes hold, every crisis starts looking like confirmation. A drought becomes part of the purification. A war becomes part of the purification. A pandemic, a wildfire season, a nuclear threat, an economic collapse, a political breakdown. Each event is fitted onto the lower line, as if the stone had predicted a sequence of disasters, and humanity is now moving through them one by one. But this is exactly where careful language matters most. Public discussions of Hopi teachings do include ideas of worlds ending, worlds changing, and people facing consequences when they abandon right relationship with the forces that sustain life. In publicly shared accounts, humanity has passed through earlier worlds, and those transitions were not gentle. They involve destruction, migration, survival, and renewal. But that is not automatically the same thing as the modern Western idea of the apocalypse. Apocalypse, in the popular sense, usually means the end of everything, the final collapse, the last war, the irreversible event after which history stops and the world is divided into the saved and the doomed. It is often imagined as a single deadline, a cosmic finish line, written in advance and waiting to arrive. The Hopi ideas that outsiders often translate as purification can point somewhere more difficult, and in some ways more demanding. Not simply annihilation, correction, not the destruction of the earth as punishment from outside, but the consequences that follow when human beings forget how to live within the limits of a living world. When water is treated as a commodity instead of a source of life. When soil is exhausted, when communities fracture. When power becomes more important than responsibility. When ceremony, gratitude, restraint, and mutual obligation are dismissed as useless because they cannot be measured in profit. In that sense, purification is not necessarily about a supernatural force arriving to destroy humanity. It can be about reality reasserting itself, Think about what happens when a society builds its entire future on the assumption that limits do not apply. It extracts more water than the land can replace. It burns fuels that alter the climate systems supporting agriculture. It creates weapons so powerful that a single decision can end millions of lives. It rewards speed, consumption, and expansion, then acts surprised when the systems beneath that expansion begin to buckle. Nothing about that requires a magical prediction. Cause and effect is frightening enough. And that may be why the lower line has become so compelling. It gives a shape to fears that are already real: environmental imbalance, social conflict, spiritual estrangement, the feeling that modern life has become incredibly powerful, while also becoming strangely disconnected from the conditions that make life possible. We can send messages around the world in seconds. We can see storms forming from space. We can split atoms, alter genes, and build machines that perform tasks once thought impossible. But can we share water fairly? Can we protect a river when doing so threatens short-term profit? Can we slow down when slowing down means giving up comfort, convenience, or control? Can we remember that a community is more than a market, and that land is more than whatever can be extracted from it? Those are not ancient questions. They are the questions sitting underneath almost every modern crisis. The lower route, in its popular interpretation, is therefore not just a road of physical disaster. It is a road of separation, separation from the land, separation from ancestors, separation from one another, separation from the responsibilities that once kept communities aware that survival was never an individual achievement. And when that separation grows deep enough, conflict follows. Not because people suddenly become evil, but because scarcity, fear, inequality, and distrust make cooperation harder. A community that has forgotten how to share will struggle when resources become limited. A society built on endless competition will find it difficult to respond when a crisis requires sacrifice. And people taught to see the world as a warehouse may not recognize the emergency until the shelves are empty. That is one reason the language of purification should not be reduced to disaster spectacle. The danger is not only that outsiders might exaggerate the prophecy, the deeper danger is that they might misunderstand its purpose. If purification becomes a thrilling prediction of global collapse, then people can consume it like entertainment. They can argue online about which sign has appeared. They can build elaborate timelines. They can announce that the end is near and feel strangely satisfied that they were among the first to notice. But none of that requires them to change. In fact, apocalypse language can become an excuse not to change. If the ending is already fixed, why protect anything? Why repair relationships? Why conserve water? Why reduce harm? Why struggle for justice in a world supposedly destined to fall apart anyway? A conditional warning asks the opposite. It says that what happens next depends, at least in part, on how people live now. This kind of teaching appears across many indigenous traditions, though each has its own history, language, and meaning. Outsiders should be careful not to flatten them into one giant ancient prophecy. But there is a recurring pattern. Warnings are often not there to satisfy curiosity about the future. They are there to preserve obligations in the present. They tell people, in effect, pay attention. Do not let arrogance become normal. Do not confuse technical power with wisdom. Do not forget that the earth can continue without any one civilization, while no civilization can continue without the earth. That is a very different message from the end is scheduled, and it may explain why the story of the Great Purification is both so unsettling and so easily distorted. Western audiences often want a date, a sequence, a final event. They want to know whether the lower line means nuclear war, climate collapse, planetary disaster, or some catastrophe still beyond imagination. But sacred concepts do not always survive translation intact. A word rendered as purification may carry associations of renewal, restoration, responsibility, and the re-establishment of balance. Once translated into the vocabulary of apocalypse, it can lose all of that. It becomes fire from the sky. It becomes a countdown clock. It becomes a story about destruction rather than a teaching about relationship. And that shift matters, because destruction is passive. It happens to you. Relationship is active. It asks something of you. Maybe the lower line is not best understood as a prediction that humanity must descend into catastrophe. Maybe it is the visible trace of what happens when warning after warning is ignored. A road made not by fate, but by accumulated choices. Choices repeated so often that they become systems. Systems defended so fiercely that people begin calling them inevitable. Then the question changes again, not, has the great purification begun? But what are we refusing to purify from our own lives? The greed that calls itself growth. The waste that calls itself convenience. The violence that calls itself security. The loneliness that calls itself independence. The lower line may not offer certainty about the future. But it does offer a challenge that is impossible to dismiss. If imbalance has consequences, then balance must be practiced before the crisis becomes irreversible. And that brings us to another mystery surrounding this rock. How did a teaching rooted in Hopi land, Hopi history, and Hopi spiritual responsibility become a global prophecy chart, passed from book to book, lecture to lecture, and eventually from one corner of the internet to another? The answer begins with a name that appears again and again in accounts of Hopi prophecy. David Mononye, a Hopi religious leader and interpreter of teachings that, for generations, had largely remained within Hopi communities. In popular retellings, Mononye is often described as one of the people who helped carry a message beyond the mesas in the middle of the 20th century. A message about balance, technological power, war, and the dangerous direction of the modern world. Another name stands beside his, Thomas Baniasaya. Baniasaya became one of the best-known Hopi peace advocates of the 20th century. For decades, he spoke publicly about a warning he understood as deeply connected to Hopi responsibilities. Humanity had gained enormous power, but had not gained the wisdom to use it safely. And this is important. Neither David Mononye nor Thomas Baniasaya can simply be treated as a spokesperson for every Hopi person, every Hopi village, every clan, or every religious society. Hopi communities are not one single voice speaking in perfect unison. Sacred knowledge is not public property. Some teachings are shared openly. Some are held closely. Some accounts differ depending on who is telling them, where they learnt them, and what they believe should be communicated to outsiders. But in the public history of Hopi prophecy, these two men became central figures. They were among the people through whom many non-Hopi audiences first encountered the idea that Hopi teachings contained a warning for the wider world. The timing was not accidental. By the 1940s, the world had seen industrial war on a scale almost beyond comprehension. Cities had been bombed into ruins. Millions were dead. Then came the atomic bomb. For the first time, human beings possessed weapons capable of destroying entire cities in seconds. Not as a metaphor, not as a distant fear, as a demonstrated fact. And suddenly warnings about imbalance, fire, destruction, and a path leading away from life did not sound like old stories to many Americans. They sounded current. They sounded terrifyingly current. Popular accounts often point to a gathering in 1948, sometimes described as a prophecy meeting involving Hopi elders and visitors from outside the community. In many versions of the story, teachings were shared because the world had entered a dangerous new period. especially after the arrival of nuclear weapons. It is a powerful story, and like many powerful stories, it has grown clearer in retelling than it is in the surviving historical record. There are references to meetings, speeches, visitors, and efforts to communicate Hopi concerns beyond Arizona. There are later accounts that look back on this period as a turning point, but the documentation is incomplete. Records are scattered. Details vary. Some popular versions repeat precise claims about what was said, who attended, and exactly when particular warnings were delivered without showing where those details came from. That does not mean nothing happened. It means we should be careful about turning a partly documented moment into a perfectly preserved scene. History is rarely that neat, especially when the subject involves oral tradition, sacred teachings, translation between cultures and communities that have very good reasons to be cautious about outsiders recording, publishing, and claiming authority over their words. Still, the broader pattern is clear. During the mid-20th century, Hopi prophecy teachings began moving outward. At first, they travelled through personal encounters. Visitors came to Hopi country. Writers, researchers, spiritual seekers, activists, and religious figures listened to public speakers. Some heard only fragments, some heard stories through interpreters. Some took notes, some remembered what they wanted to remember. Then those fragments entered print. A speech became an article. An article became a chapter in a book. A book became the source for another book, which added a few details, removed a few qualifications, and made the story easier to tell. Then came lectures, then films, then documentary specials, then cassette tapes, radio programs, conference stages, websites, podcasts, social media posts, and dramatic images of the Prophecy Rock with arrows, labels, and bright red circles announcing, "We are here," and each time the story moved, it changed. Think of it like copying a map by hand. The first person traces the roads carefully. The second person makes the lines darker. The third person adds a landmark they think should be there. The fourth person mistakes a smudge for a symbol. By the 10th copy, everyone is treating the new detail as if it had always been part of the original. That is how a teaching can become a prophecy chart. Not necessarily through deliberate deception, often through repetition, simplification, translation. The pressure to make a complex tradition fit the expectations of an audience trained to ask different questions. Western audiences wanted dates. They wanted predictions. They wanted to know whether a particular line meant airplanes, trains, highways, electricity, world wars, satellites, computers, or nuclear missiles. They wanted the rock to function like a coded forecast. But the public message associated with Banyasea was often less interested in prediction than responsibility. In 1992, Thomas Banyasea addressed the United Nations during a period of growing international concern about environmental crisis. The Cold War was ending, but nuclear weapons still existed. Industrial pollution was spreading. Climate science was becoming impossible to ignore. Nations were beginning, however slowly, to speak about the planet as a shared system under pressure. Banyasea brought a warning that was also a challenge. Humanity, he argued, had reached a point where it had to choose. It could continue down a path of greed, conflict, and disrespect for the earth, or it could return to balance. That message was not unique to one people. Concern for water, land, peace, and future generations belongs to all humanity. But its meaning came from a specific place: Hopi land, Hopi memory, Hopi ceremonial responsibility, and Hopi experience under the pressure of the modern world. And that context is exactly what often disappeared as the prophecy entered New Age media. The teachings became detached from villages, families, language, and land. They were blended with Mayan calendars, Christian apocalypse, UFO stories, global energy shifts, lost continents, and every new fear of the moment. A warning about right relationship became a scavenger hunt for signs. The result was a strange contradiction. The more famous Hopi prophecy became, the less Hopi it sometimes sounded. And once the rock became a global symbol, another question became unavoidable. How much of the diagram people share today is ancient stone carving, and how much is the modern story built around it? That question became impossible to separate from the age in which the rock became famous. Because the 20th century did not just give people new ways to circulate prophecy. It gave them a reason to search for prophecy with an urgency previous generations could barely imagine. On July 16, 1945, the first atomic bomb exploded in the New Mexico desert. Less than a month later, atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The scale of death was horrific, but the deeper shock was this: human beings had crossed a threshold. For thousands of years, fire had been a tool, a source of warmth, protection, cooking, ceremony, industry. Now fire had become something else, a weapon whose light could burn hotter than the sun, whose blast could erase a city, whose invisible radiation could continue harming bodies long after the explosion was over. And after 1945, the fear did not fade. It expanded. The United States and the Soviet Union built larger and larger nuclear arsenals. Bombers flew overhead. Missile silos were buried underground. School children practiced hiding beneath desks. Families built fallout shelters in their backyards, stocked with canned food and water, wondering whether a warning siren might mean the end of the world. This was the Cold War, not a war fought constantly between two armies on one battlefield, but a global standoff built on the possibility that one mistake, one miscalculation, one launch could trigger catastrophe on a planetary scale. And in that atmosphere, ancient warning narratives suddenly felt different. A story about imbalance was no longer only about moral failure. It could sound like mushroom clouds. A story about destruction from the sky could sound like bombers. A warning about the misuse of power could sound like nuclear testing in the desert. Radioactive fallout drifting through the air, and governments preparing for a war no one could truly win. For many people encountering public accounts of Hopi teachings, one phrase became especially powerful. The gourd of ashes, in widely circulated versions of Hopi prophecy, the gourd of ashes is described as a sign associated with destruction, sometimes with a frighteningly specific modern interpretation: atomic weapons. In some retellings it is said that the gourd would be thrown from the sky, its ashes falling over the earth, burning the land and causing sickness. You can see why that image struck people so deeply after Hiroshima. A vessel thrown through the air, a blinding detonation, ash or dust descending afterward, a poisoned landscape. To audiences shaped by nuclear fear, the connection seemed obvious. Too obvious, in fact, for many people to question where the exact wording came from, how old a particular version was, or whether every part of the story had been consistently documented before the atomic age. And this is where the investigation gets difficult. There are public statements by Hopi figures, including Thomas Baniaseer, that warned about atomic power, war, and humanity's failure to live in balance. There are accounts connecting Hopi teachings to a gourd of ashes. There are writers who recorded versions of these ideas in the decades after World War II. But there is not one single, universally accepted, perfectly preserved text that all Hopi people recognize as the definitive nuclear prophecy. The phrase does not function like a line in a government document, where you can identify an original copy, compare signatures, and settle every question with a date stamp. It belongs to a landscape of oral teaching, translation, public testimony, private knowledge, and repeated retelling. That means some versions may preserve meaningful elements of tradition. Others may combine separate teachings, others may sharpen symbolic language into a literal prediction. because literal predictions are what outside audiences were looking for. Think about what happens when fear meets ambiguity. You have a story with an image of ashes. Then the most destructive weapon in history appears. People look backward through the story and see the bomb already waiting there. Sometimes that process can reveal a powerful moral connection. But sometimes it can also create certainty that the evidence itself cannot support. The Cold War encouraged that certainty. It trained entire populations to imagine apocalypse as a technical possibility. Civil defense films showed families how to survive an attack. Newspapers tracked missile ranges. Scientists warned about nuclear winter, the possibility that enough explosions could throw smoke into the atmosphere, block sunlight, collapse agriculture, and kill millions far from the blast zones. For the first time, the end of the world was not only religious language, it was military planning, and when a culture is living under that kind of threat, it becomes hungry for warnings. Not vague warnings, specific ones, signs that someone saw this coming. Signs that disaster is not random, signs that there is still time to avoid it. That hunger helped turn the Prophecy Rock into something larger than a petroglyph. People began reading every line as a timeline, every break as a future catastrophe, every symbol as an invention, and the gourd of ashes became, for many, the emotional centre of the whole story. Evidence, they believed, that an ancient people had foreseen the atomic age. But maybe the more important question is not whether every modern detail can be proven to have been carved into a prophecy long before 1945. Maybe the more important question is why the warning landed with such force. Because nuclear weapons did not create the problem of imbalance. They revealed what imbalance could become when knowledge outruns responsibility. The scientists who split the atom achieved something extraordinary. The governments that turned that knowledge into weapons created a danger that could not be contained by national borders. Radiation does not need a passport. Fallout does not respect property lines. A nuclear exchange would not remain the problem of one country, one army, or one generation. That is exactly why language about balance, restraint, and responsibility could speak so directly to the nuclear age. Not because it had to function as a technical blueprint of the bomb, but because it named the deeper pattern: human beings gaining power faster than wisdom, choosing domination over relationship, treating the earth as a stage for conflict rather than the source of life itself. And that pattern did not end when the Cold War cooled. Nuclear weapons remain, thousands still exist, accidents remain possible, misunderstanding remains possible. The technology has changed. The political map has changed, but the underlying question is still here. What do people do when they possess the power to destroy far more than they understand? A prophecy does not need to predict the exact shape of a weapon to influence action. A warning can work another way. It can force a person to stop, to see their own time as dangerous, to recognize that the future is not guaranteed, to understand that consequences may reach children they will never meet. Even if the literal details remain uncertain, that moral pressure is real, and it explains why, in the shadow of the bomb, so many people turned toward an old image carved into stone and asked the same desperate question: were we warned? And once people began asking that question, the image did not stay in its local setting for long. It travelled, first through lectures, newsletters, newspaper articles and books, then through spiritual bookstores and classroom handouts, later through photocopied posters passed from person to person, and eventually through websites, blogs, video essays, meme pages and social media feeds, where a single image can reach millions before anyone asks where it came from. That is how the Prophecy Rock became something very different from a carving encountered in a Hopi cultural landscape. It became a map of the modern world. Online, you will often see a familiar version, a central figure, a line representing the path of life, a fork, a lower path. Symbols identified as trains, power lines, airplanes, factories, atomic bombs, computers, or a world-ending collapse. Sometimes the image arrives with a caption declaring that the Hopi predicted everything: industrialization, world wars, the moon landing, nuclear weapons, climate change, even the exact crisis unfolding right now. And it is powerful because it appears to offer the thing people want most in uncertain times: a pattern, not just chaos, not just one disaster after another, a pattern someone recognized long before we did. But here is the problem. The image most people encounter is often not a direct photograph of a rock panel, presented with its location, history, and competing interpretations. It is a redrawing, sometimes a careful redrawing, sometimes a heavily modified one. Lines are darkened so they can be seen on a printed page. Faint marks are simplified, missing sections are filled in. Symbols are isolated from the larger panel. Then captions get added. Arrows get added. Numbers get added. A line that may be ambiguous becomes a railroad track. A small shape becomes an airplane. A branching form becomes a telephone pole, then an electrical grid, then the internet. And once a label is printed beside a symbol, it can become almost impossible to see the symbol without the label. That is the strange power of a diagram. It does not merely show you an interpretation. It makes the interpretation feel like part of the original object. Imagine someone 100 years from now finding a modern subway map with handwritten notes all over it. Danger here. This line leads to collapse. This station represents war. If they treated every note as part of the original design, they would not be reading the map. They would be reading layers of later fear, hope, and imagination laid on top of it. That is often what happens with prophecy images online. The original carving, the published drawing, the author's explanation, the editor's caption, the poster designer's additions, and the social media user's claim can all get compressed into one thing: the Hopi prophecy. But those are not the same thing. And that distinction matters because sources have histories. A version printed in a 1960s book may reflect Cold War anxiety. A poster from the 1970s may emphasize environmental destruction. A New Age website from the 1990s may connect the symbols to planetary alignment or spiritual awakening. A post made yesterday may insist the rock predicted artificial intelligence, pandemics, digital surveillance, or whatever fear dominates the news cycle this week. Each generation looks at the lines and sees its own emergency. That does not necessarily mean every person is acting in bad faith. Sometimes people are genuinely moved by a warning about imbalance. Sometimes they are trying to connect an old teaching to a real danger, and sometimes the broad moral message does travel across time. Power without responsibility can destroy the conditions that sustain life. But there is a difference between hearing a warning and claiming ownership of it. If you're enjoying this investigation into mysteries, our book about 12 unexplained mysteries is available on the website, and the link is in the description. Because this is one of the biggest mysteries in the entire story. How does a specific cultural image become a container for the anxieties of the entire planet? Part of the answer is that modern crises are overwhelming. Climate change is global. Nuclear weapons are global. Water shortages, pandemics, war, mass extinction, technological disruption. All of them seem too large for any one person to understand. We live surrounded by data, alerts, predictions, maps, graphs, and experts who often disagree. So an ancient-looking image with a clear fork in the road feels almost irresistible. It says, "This has happened before." It says, "Someone knew." It says, "There is still a choice." That last part may be the most important. People do not only share prophecy because they want to be afraid. They share it because they want the future to mean something. They want catastrophe to be a warning rather than a random punishment. They want to believe that if humanity changes course, disaster can still be avoided. But that desire can create another danger. Indigenous traditions can become raw material for outsider spirituality. A sacred teaching becomes an inspirational quote. A community's history becomes a backdrop for someone else's personal awakening. A complex tradition becomes a conspiracy video claiming that ancient people knew the secret truth that governments, scientists, and institutions are hiding. And in that process, living Hopi people can disappear from their own story. The irony is hard to miss. People may share a prophecy about respect, balance, and responsibility, while ignoring the authority of the people whose tradition they claim to honour. They may treat every unclear mark as proof of secret knowledge, while refusing to acknowledge uncertainty. They may speak confidently about Hopi teachings without knowing which Hopi source said what, when it was said, whether it was intended for public circulation, or whether other Hopi voices interpret the material differently. That is not respect for tradition. That is extraction. So when you see the Prophecy Rock online, pause before accepting the caption, "Is this a photograph of the actual panel or a later drawing? Who made the drawing? When was it published? Are the arrows and labels part of the original source or additions made afterward? Does the post identify a Hopi speaker, author, or community source? Does it distinguish between a documented public teaching and a modern interpretation? And perhaps most importantly, does it admit what it does not know? Real history is often less tidy than a viral image. It has gaps. It has disagreements. It has translations, retellings, and questions that cannot be solved with one dramatic caption. But that does not make the rock less meaningful. It makes it more human. Because the Prophecy Rock did not become a modern prophecy map, simply because ancient lines perfectly predicted modern inventions. It became one because people living through nuclear fear, environmental crisis, and technological acceleration needed a language for the feeling that humanity had reached a crossroads. The lines became a mirror, and every generation has stepped in front of that mirror, pointed to the fork, and asked a version of the same question. Is this where we are now? But before we can ask whether the rock predicted our moment, there is an even more basic question. How old is it? And that sounds like it should have a simple answer. Find the rock, test it, get a date, case closed, except rock art does not work like that. If archaeologists excavate a fire pit, they may find charcoal buried in a known layer of soil. That charcoal can sometimes be radiocarbon dated. If they find wood, bone, seeds, cloth, or other organic material associated with a site, they may be able to build a timeline from the evidence around it. But a petroglyph is different. It is not paint sitting on a canvas. It is an image made by pecking, scraping, or abrading the outer surface of stone. The artist removes part of a darkened outer coating, often called desert varnish or patina, exposing lighter rock underneath. And stone does not come with a timestamp. The rock itself may be millions of years old. The dark surface on that rock may have formed over centuries, thousands of years or much longer, depending on the climate, the minerals, the microbes, wind, rain, and exposure. The engraving may have been made at any point after the surface developed. And the meaning people attached to the engraving may have changed many times after that. Those are three completely different questions. How old is the rock? How old is the carving? And how old is the interpretation claiming that this specific line represents a railroad, an airplane, an atomic bomb, or the present age? People often compress all three into one dramatic statement. This ancient rock predicted modern technology, but even if a panel is old, that does not automatically prove every feature is equally old. A single rock face can carry markings made at different times. One person may add a figure beside a much older figure. A later visitor may deepen an existing line. Someone may scratch initials into the same surface. Natural cracks may be incorporated into a design, and a modern tracing may combine marks from several places on the panel into one clean, persuasive image. Imagine a whiteboard that has been used for 100 years. Messages erased, redrawn, written over, copied into notebooks, edited by later hands. Then imagine someone taking a single photograph of it and insisting every line was written on the same afternoon by the same person. That is the danger. Archaeologists can sometimes estimate relative age by looking at repatination. When a fresh line is cut into dark rock, the newly exposed interior is often lighter. Over time, weathering and mineral deposits may darken it again. A mark that has repatinated heavily may be older than one that still looks fresh, but maybe is doing important work there. Sunlight, rain, runoff, elevation, mineral chemistry, and the angle of the rock can all affect how a groove changes. Two marks made at the same time can weather differently. Two marks made centuries apart can end up looking surprisingly similar. Repatination can offer clues. It is not a magic clock. There are more advanced methods. Researchers may examine microscopic weathering, mineral crusts, residues, or the build-up of varnish. In rare situations, a carving can be connected to archaeological material found nearby or beneath fallen rock. Superimposed images can also help establish a sequence. If one figure is clearly carved over another, then at least we know which came later. But even then, dating often produces ranges, probabilities, and careful language. Earlier than this, later than that, probably associated with this period, consistent with that style, not usually made in this exact year by this exact person to predict an event 2,000 years in the future. And then there is photography. A photograph feels objective. It feels like the eye of a machine, simply recording what is there. But rock art photography is difficult. Light can make shallow grooves suddenly visible, then erase them minutes later. Shadows can turn natural fractures into deliberate lines. Digital contrast can reveal faint marks, but it can also exaggerate texture and create the impression of connections that are not actually clear on the stone. A redrawing introduces another layer. The person making it has to decide which marks matter. Is that faint scratch intentional? Is that vertical groove part of the design or weather damage? Does that branching shape belong to one figure, or is it three separate markings? Every tracing involves judgment. A good researcher documents those judgments. A viral image usually hides them, and access itself can be a problem. Many rock art sites are protected, restricted, remote, or not publicly identified for good reason. Publicizing exact locations can invite vandalism, theft, graffiti, and damage from visitors who mean well but touch surfaces they should never touch. Some locations also have cultural restrictions. Not every site, image, ceremony, or interpretation is meant to be opened up for unlimited outside inspection. That can frustrate people who want a simple answer. They want coordinates. They want high-resolution images. They want an independent investigator to arrive with a camera and announce the final truth. But responsible research does not mean treating every culturally significant place as public property. It means accepting that evidence has limits and that communities have rights. So can the Hopi Prophecy Rock be authenticated? Parts of that question can be investigated. Researchers can examine published sources. They can compare photographs with redrawings. They can identify when certain versions of the image entered public circulation. They can study whether markings appear ancient, recent, altered, or ambiguous. They can ask what Hopi speakers have said publicly and distinguish those statements from claims made by outsiders. But authentication is not one switch that flips from false to true. There is no single laboratory test that can prove an entire modern prophecy narrative exactly as it appears online. And uncertainty does not mean the tradition is meaningless. That is the other mistake. One extreme says every line is a precise forecast. The other says, if we cannot date every mark to the exact year, then it is all nonsense. Neither position is serious. Cultural teachings do not become empty because they cannot be reduced to a laboratory measurement. Oral traditions, ceremonial knowledge, historical memory, and moral instruction operate differently from a chemical assay. They carry meaning through communities, relationships, repeated telling, and responsibilities that may extend far beyond what an outsider can verify from a photograph. At the same time, meaning does not give anyone permission to invent evidence. Respect requires both humility and discipline. Believe nothing blindly. Dismiss nothing casually. Ask what can be documented. Ask what remains uncertain. Ask who is speaking, who is being quoted, and who benefits when a complex tradition is turned into a simple prediction machine. Because the real mystery is not solved by declaring the rock either supernatural proof or a fraud. The real mystery is how ancient marks, living teachings, modern fears, and endless retellings became fused into one image powerful enough to make millions of people ask the same question. Not just, what does this symbol mean? But what if the warning was never about identifying the exact date of collapse? What if it was about recognizing the pattern before it is too late? That question matters because the phrase "exactly where we are now" is doing a lot of work. It is the phrase that turns a warning into a prophecy. A carved line becomes a railroad, then a telephone wire, then an electrical grid, then the internet. A figure holding something becomes a weapon, then a machine, then a computer. A branching path becomes a choice between spiritual balance and technological destruction, and suddenly the rock is no longer an object of interpretation. It is a map with a glowing dot marked, "You are here." That is an incredibly powerful feeling, but power is not the same thing as proof. Human beings are pattern recognition machines. We see faces in clouds, animals in constellations, messages in coincidence. Most of the time, this ability helps us survive. Your ancestors heard a rustle in the grass and assumed there might be a predator. Better to notice a pattern that was not there than ignore one that was. But the same ability can make us connect broad symbols to whatever frightens us most. A line crossing a path can become a railroad in the 19th century. In the 20th century, it can become power lines, pipelines, or the path of airplanes. During the Cold War, it can become the nuclear age. In the age of satellite television, it becomes global communication. In the age of smartphones, cloud computing, artificial intelligence, and social media, people look at that same line and see digital networks wrapping around the planet. And each generation can feel certain that it is the generation the rock was describing. This is called retrospective fitting. You start with an event you already know happened, then look backward for a symbol broad enough to match it. The match can feel startling because the world is full of roads, wires, machines, crises, migrations, and choices. A simple image can hold many possibilities. Think about a horoscope written in vague language. You will face a major decision. Almost everyone can find a major decision somewhere in their life. You may feel pressure from forces beyond your control. That could describe war, debt, illness, family conflict, climate disaster, or simply a bad week at work. The statement is not meaningless. It may even feel deeply true. But it is not a precise forecast. The same distinction matters here. There may be a meaningful ethical parallel between a teaching about balance and a world driven by extraction, speed, and disconnection. There may be a real resonance between warnings about selfishness, imbalance, and spiritual neglect, and the crises modern societies are now facing. But resonance is not the same as a timestamp. A warning does not have to predict the invention of the internet, the date of a war, or the exact shape of a future catastrophe in order to say something urgent. In fact, the demand for exact prediction may cause us to miss the deeper message completely. Because if the only question is, did this rock predict our technology? Then we are treating Hopi teachings like a puzzle designed for outsiders to solve. Find the symbol, match it to the gadget, declare victory. But living traditions are not treasure maps. They are not ancient code books waiting for a viral video to crack them open. They exist within relationships, to land, to community, to ceremony, to responsibilities that cannot always be separated into neat captions beneath a photograph. And there is another reason exactly where we are now is so tempting. We live in an age of instability. The climate is changing in ways people can see. Seasons feel less reliable. Drought, wildfire, flooding, extreme heat, and water shortages are no longer distant headlines for many communities. Wars move through our phones in real time. Technology changes faster than laws, schools, families, and governments can adapt. Artificial intelligence promises convenience, wealth, surveillance, confusion, and disruption all at once. When the future feels chaotic, people go looking for maps. They want signs because signs suggest that someone knew. They want prophecies because prophecy suggests that the chaos has a shape. And if the chaos has a shape, maybe it has an ending too. That is the emotional force behind the image of the prophecy rock. It offers something modern life often cannot: a clear path, a visible fork, and the terrifying possibility that we have already travelled too far down one side. But certainty can be dangerous when it becomes an excuse for passivity. If people believe collapse is written in stone, they may stop asking what can still be changed. If they believe they have decoded the final warning, they may become less interested in the hard work of listening, learning, repairing, conserving, and taking responsibility. And that would be a strange way to respond to a teaching about choice. Maybe the better question is not whether the rock identifies our precise year, our precise machine, or our precise crisis. Maybe it identifies something more persistent, a recurring human decision. Do we organize life around restraint or endless consumption? Do we treat land and water as relatives, responsibilities, and sources of life, or as inventory? Do we build technologies without asking what they are doing to our relationships? Do we mistake speed for progress, power for wisdom, and comfort for security? Those questions would have mattered during industrialization. They mattered during the nuclear arms race. They mattered when highways, dams, mines, and power lines reshaped entire landscapes. They matter in the era of algorithms, data centers, drought, and a warming planet. That does not make every modern interpretation historically proven. It makes the warning harder to escape, because a symbol can be broad without being empty. A crossroads may not tell us what year it is. It may tell us what kind of moment we are in, whenever human beings reach a point where their tools have become powerful, their appetites have become enormous, and their relationship with the living world has become dangerously out of balance. And if that is the message, then the question is no longer, are we exactly here? The question becomes far more uncomfortable. Which road are we choosing now? And that brings us to the road most often associated with the modern world. Not a road with a smartphone carved into it. Not a line that can be honestly translated as artificial intelligence, satellites, electricity, or the internet. The rock does not name these things. The older Hopi teachings connected to balance, obligation, humility, and right relationship were not written as a technical forecast of future devices. But many people see a broader pattern. They look at one path and see movement away from restraint, away from the limits that keep a community alive, away from the idea that land, water, animals and future generations place obligations on the people living now. They see a road of acceleration, and it is hard to deny that modern life accelerates almost everything. A message that once took weeks to travel across a continent arrives in less than a second. A company can move money, products, images, and personal information around the planet at a speed no human community evolved to understand. A decision made in one boardroom can affect a forest, a river, a mine, a factory, or a neighborhood thousands of miles away. We call this progress because often it is progress. Technology can heal. It can connect families across oceans. It can detect disease, predict storms, help farmers use less water, make dangerous work safer, and give people access to knowledge that was once locked behind walls of wealth and distance. There is nothing inherently wicked about a tool. A hammer can build a home or break a window. Fire can cook food or burn a forest. The question has never been whether humans should have power. The question is, what happens when power outruns responsibility? Think about the speed of the last 2 centuries. First came coal, railroads, factories and industrial extraction on a scale the world had never seen. Then oil, automobiles, airplanes, plastics, chemical agriculture, global supply chains and machines capable of turning mountains into gravel. Then computers, then networks, then platforms designed to hold human attention as long as possible. Each step solved problems. Each step created new ones. The road became faster, and when a road becomes fast enough, people stop looking out the window. They stop asking what is being left behind. A mine can provide jobs, metals and energy. But it can also poison water and leave a scar on land that lasts longer than the company that made the profit. A dam can generate electricity and control floods. It can also drown valleys, disrupt rivers, and transform the lives of communities downstream. A data center can support the digital services millions of people use every day. It can also consume enormous amounts of electricity and water in regions already facing strain. None of this means every mine, dam, factory, or server is automatically wrong. It means that a civilization obsessed with expansion has a habit of counting the benefits first and treating the consequences as somebody else's problem. Usually somebody poorer, somebody farther away, somebody not yet born. That is where the idea of imbalance becomes more than a vague spiritual phrase. Imbalance is when a society takes from a place faster than that place can recover. It is when convenience becomes more important than connection, when efficiency becomes more important than care, when growth is treated as success even if the rivers are shrinking, the soil is exhausted and people are lonelier than ever. And now the speed is increasing again. Automation is changing work faster than many workers can retrain. Algorithms decide what people see, what they buy, what they fear, and sometimes whether they are considered eligible for jobs, loans, housing, or insurance. Artificial intelligence can produce images, voices, essays, code, and convincing falsehoods in seconds. Facial recognition, location tracking, online records, and connected devices have made surveillance possible at a scale that would once have belonged only to authoritarian fantasies. The technology itself is not one thing. It can help find missing people, translate languages, identify medical problems, and reduce repetitive labor. But it can also concentrate power, and concentrated power has always needed limits. There is another cost that is harder to measure because it does not show up clearly on a balance sheet. Attention. The modern attention economy does not simply compete for a few minutes of your time. It studies behavior, tests emotional triggers, and learns which notifications, headlines, arguments, fears, and desires are most likely to keep you looking. Outrage travels fast. Fear travels fast. Humiliation travels fast. A person can be surrounded by messages all day and still feel profoundly alone. We are connected to everyone and sometimes connected to no one. That may be one reason the old language of balance feels so unsettling now. It points towards something modern systems struggle to value: enough. Enough extraction, enough speed, enough consumption, enough noise. Not because human beings must reject innovation and return to some imagined past that would turn a serious teaching into another simplistic fantasy. No society survives by freezing in time. Hopi communities themselves have endured change, pressure, adaptation, displacement, and the constant work of carrying tradition forward in a changing world. The deeper question is whether innovation can have a conscience. Can we build powerful tools and still accept limits? Can we develop automation without abandoning workers? Can we use artificial intelligence without surrendering judgment? Can we create global networks without allowing every human relationship to become data? Can we generate wealth without treating living systems as raw material, waiting to be converted into profit? Those are not ancient questions in the sense of being outdated. They are ancient because human beings have always faced them whenever they gained new power. A path is not just a route across the ground, it is a direction repeated over time. One decision becomes a habit becomes an institution becomes a civilization. By the time people notice where the road is leading, they may have travelled very far. That is why the image of a fork matters. It does not require us to condemn technology. It asks us to stop worshipping it. It asks whether our tools are serving life, or whether life is being reorganized to serve the tools. Because the danger may not be a machine becoming evil. The danger may be something more ordinary. Human beings becoming so impressed by what they can do that they no longer ask what they should do. And nowhere is that question more immediate than in the dry country of the Southwest, where technology, growth, extraction, and climate are all colliding with the most basic requirement of life. Water. Water. In the Southwest. Water is never just water. It is time, it is survival, it is memory. It is the difference between a field that produces corn and a field that becomes dust. It is the difference between a spring that supports a village for generations and a dry basin where people are forced to leave. For Hopi communities, this is not an abstract idea. The Hopi mesas of northern Arizona sit in a land of dramatic beauty and severe limits. Rain can be scarce. Streams can run only seasonally. The soil can be productive, but only when people understand its rhythms and work with conditions that outsiders have often dismissed as impossible. For centuries, Hopi farmers developed dry farming methods suited to this difficult land. They planted crops such as corn, beans, and squash in ways that made use of limited moisture. They watched clouds, wind, soil, and the timing of rain. They selected seeds adapted to local conditions. They built knowledge across generations, not through a single invention, but through long attention. Attention is a technology too, and it may be one of the oldest technologies human beings have. To farm in a dry landscape is to understand something industrial society often forgets. You are not in control. You can prepare the ground. You can save seed. You can work hard. You can plan. But you cannot order rain from the sky. You cannot force a watershed to recover just because a growing city needs more houses, more golf courses, more factories, more data centers, more lawns that stay bright green through a desert summer. Eventually, the limits speak. Today, those limits are becoming impossible to ignore. Much of the American Southwest has faced prolonged drought, rising temperatures, shrinking snowpack, depleted groundwater, and increasing pressure on rivers that were already divided among too many competing demands. The Colorado River is the clearest example. It supplies water to millions of people across several US states and Mexico. It supports farms, cities, industry ecosystems, and tribal nations. But the modern system built around it was designed during an unusually wet period in the early 20th century. The promised water was, in many ways, greater than the river could reliably provide. Then the climate got hotter, and hotter temperatures changed the equation even when rainfall does not simply disappear. Heat pulls moisture from soil. It increases evaporation from reservoirs. It reduces snowpack and changes the timing of runoff. Water that once arrived gradually, released from mountain snow through spring and summer, can arrive differently, earlier, or not at all. A river can look large on a map. That does not mean there is enough water in it. Lake Mead and Lake Powell, the giant reservoirs created by dams on the Colorado River, became symbols of that reality as their water levels fell to alarming lows in recent years. The problem was not one bad summer. It was the collision of long-term overuse, population growth, agricultural demand, legal agreements, and a warming climate. And when water gets scarce, the question is never only scientific. It becomes political. Who gets water first? Cities or farms? Old users or new users? Wealthy developments or rural communities? Industry or ecosystems? One state or another? And what happens when the people whose lands were taken, whose rivers were diverted, or whose water rights were ignored are told yet again that there is not enough to go around? Those are moral questions disguised as management questions. This is where teachings about balance can feel newly immediate. Not because drought proves a petroglyph predicted the 21st century. It does not. No honest reading of the Hopi Prophecy Rock can turn falling reservoir levels into a timestamp or claim that climate disruption is the final confirmation of some ancient forecast. That kind of claim may be dramatic, but it also makes the real crisis easier to avoid. If people believe disaster was written in stone and cannot be changed, then they can treat collapse like entertainment. They can watch it happen, argue over symbols, and tell themselves that human choices no longer matter. But choices are exactly what matter. The Southwest is not suffering because people fail to decode a message correctly. It is under stress because modern systems have repeatedly treated water as if it were an endlessly expandable resource. Pump more groundwater, build another canal, dig deeper wells. Move water farther, promise more development, deal with the consequences later. That logic works for a while, until it doesn't. Groundwater offers a brutal example. Aquifers can feel invisible and therefore unlimited. Water is pumped from beneath the ground, fields grow, towns expand, and everything appears normal. But some groundwater reserves took centuries or thousands of years to accumulate. If they are drained faster than nature can replace them, they are not being managed. They are being mined, and mines run out. Local ecological knowledge challenges this extractive mindset because it begins from a different question. Not how much can we take, but what can this place sustain? That sounds simple. It is not. It requires humility. It requires accepting that a desert is not a failed version of a wetter place. It is a living system with its own cycles, limits, and relationships. It requires listening to people who have spent generations learning how to live there, including indigenous communities, whose knowledge has too often been ignored until a crisis makes outsiders suddenly interested. Even then, respect matters. Traditional knowledge is not a free resource for corporations, governments, or tourists to collect and use however they want. It belongs within living communities. It includes responsibilities, context, and relationships that cannot be reduced to a motivational quote about sustainability. But the larger lesson is available to everyone. A society that depends on water must protect the conditions that produce water. Healthy forests matter, healthy soils matter, wetlands matter, snowpack matters. Rivers need to flow, aquifers need time to recharge, and communities need systems that do not reward waste simply because someone else will pay the cost. Climate disruption makes all of this more urgent, not mystical. Urgent. The warning is not that the sky has sent us a secret code. The warning is that the land is responding to what we do, and land does not negotiate with slogans. And that brings us to a question that is bigger than the rock itself. Who gets to tell this story? For more than half a century, outsiders have photographed the Hopi Prophecy Rock, copied its symbols into books, mapped it onto timelines, connected it to wars, pollution, space travel, climate change, and nuclear destruction. Some did it with genuine admiration. Some were searching for meaning in a frightening world. Some were simply selling a mystery. But the Hopi are not characters in somebody else's apocalypse story. They are living people, contemporary communities, families raising children, farmers working difficult land, artists, teachers, leaders, veterans, language keepers, ceremonial societies, and citizens of the Hopi tribe. Their villages are not ruins from a vanished world. Their traditions are not artifacts waiting for the internet to decode them. And that matters because the moment outsiders begin treating a living people as the owners of an ancient warning designed specifically for us, something gets distorted. The story becomes less about Hopi people and more about outsider anxiety. We take a symbol from a place we may never have visited. We detach it from its language, its landscape, its ceremonies, its responsibilities, and its community. Then we place it inside our own fears. Fear of collapse, fear of technology, fear of war, fear that history is spinning out of control. The result can sound respectful. It can even sound spiritual. But respect is not just saying that indigenous knowledge is wise. Respect means recognizing that not all knowledge is ours to take. This is especially important with ceremonial and sacred material. Many indigenous traditions, including Hopi traditions, contain teachings that are not meant for public circulation. They may belong to particular clans, societies, families, or ceremonial contexts. They may be shared at certain times, in certain places, with certain responsibilities attached, that can be difficult for modern audiences to accept. We are used to the idea that information wants to be free. Search for something, click a link, watch a video, download a document. We have built an entire culture around access. But access is not the same thing as permission. And permission is not the same thing as understanding. A photograph can show a carving. A book can translate a story. A documentary can repeat a prophecy. But none of those things automatically give an outsider the right to interpret every symbol, repeat every teaching, or demand answers about what is private. Some things are not hidden because they are mysterious clues. They are protected because they are sacred. That distinction changes the whole conversation. It also means there is no single Hopi voice that can be pulled from the internet and treated as the final answer. Hopi people, like any people, are not identical in their views. Individuals and communities may differ over what public prophecy narratives mean, whether particular versions are accurate, how much should be shared with outsiders, or whether the famous rock should even carry the enormous burden outsiders have placed on it. Some Hopi speakers have chosen to share teachings publicly, often to urge responsibility, humility, peace, and care for the earth. Their words deserve attention, especially when they speak directly about their own traditions. But public statements do not mean every related teaching has become public property, and one speaker does not erase the authority, privacy, or disagreement of others. This is where the popular version of the prophecy story can become dangerous. It turns a complex living tradition into a single dramatic narrative with a countdown attached. It implies that Hopi people possess a secret schedule for the end of the world, and that outsiders only need to study the right lines on the right rock to uncover it. That is not curiosity. That is extraction, wearing the costume of reverence. It asks, what can this tradition give us? A more respectful question is, what responsibilities do we have when we learn from a tradition that is not ours? The answer begins with sovereignty. The Hopi tribe is a sovereign indigenous nation. Sovereignty is not just a legal phrase, it means Hopi people have the right to govern their lands, protect their heritage, define their own priorities, and decide what is shared, what is not shared, and who gets to speak for their communities. That right exists whether outsiders find it convenient or not. It applies when filmmakers want access, when researchers want interviews, when tourists want photographs, when publishers want a dramatic story, when online creators want to turn sacred material into content. Especially then, because a prophecy warning can become a product very quickly. A video title promises that an ancient people predicted exactly where we are now. A thumbnail adds flames, storms, and a glowing petroglyph. The audience clicks, the story spreads. The community whose tradition is being used may have little control over any of it. That does not mean nobody should learn about Hopi history or public Hopi teachings. It means learning has standards. Start with credible sources. Look for work by Hopi authors, tribal institutions, reputable historians, anthropologists who clearly identify their sources, and journalists who distinguish evidence from speculation. Pay attention to dates, names, and context. Ask whether a claim comes from a documented public statement, a later retelling, or someone repeating someone else's memory. Be cautious when a source promises secret knowledge. Be even more cautious when it claims the prophecy has been proven by whatever crisis dominates the news this week. The world is full of real dangers. Drought is real. Climate disruption is real. Nuclear weapons are real. Ecological damage is real. None of those realities need a sensationalized prophecy to become urgent. And when a source reaches beyond what can be supported, say so. This is one interpretation. This version is disputed. This detail appears in later popular accounts. Those are not boring phrases. They are the difference between investigation and mythology dressed up as fact. Respect also means honouring limits. Sometimes the responsible answer is, we do not know. Sometimes it is, this is not ours to interpret. Sometimes it is, a community has asked for privacy, and that request matters more than our appetite for another revelation. That may feel unsatisfying in a culture trained to solve every mystery. But perhaps that discomfort is part of the lesson. Not every sacred thing becomes more meaningful when it is exposed, analysed, and consumed by millions of strangers. A warning is not entertainment. It is not a collectible artifact from the past. And if we are serious about learning from Hopi voices, then the first thing we may need to learn is how to listen without trying to possess what we hear. And once you understand that, another pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The Hopi Prophecy Rock is rarely left alone. Almost as soon as outsiders encounter it, they begin connecting it to everything else. The Maya calendar, the Book of Revelation, the lost civilization of Atlantis, Tibetan, teachings ancient Egypt, star people, extraterrestrials, secret societies, hidden knowledge supposedly scattered across the world like pieces of one enormous cosmic puzzle. On the surface, the connections can feel convincing. One tradition speaks of worlds destroyed and renewed. Another describes an age of corruption before a cleansing. Another warns that humans have forgotten their responsibilities. Another imagines fire, flood, darkness, or upheaval. Put the stories side by side, highlight the most dramatic phrases, and suddenly it looks like every civilization on Earth was predicting the same final event. But that is not how evidence works. Human beings have lived through droughts, wars, epidemics, migrations, crop failures, floods, volcanic eruptions, and the collapse of political systems for thousands of years. Every society has had to confront the same terrifying fact. The world that sustains you can change. The rains can fail. Leaders can become corrupt. A powerful empire can fall. A river can flood. A forest can disappear. A way of life that seemed permanent can become impossible in a single generation. Of course, human cultures developed stories about decline, danger, responsibility, destruction, and renewal. Those are not obscure themes. They are among the oldest themes in human memory. A community living beside rivers may tell stories about catastrophic floods. A people living in dry country may preserve teachings about water, balance, and the consequences of failing to care for the land. A society under foreign conquest may imagine justice arriving at the end of history. A civilization watching its rulers abuse power may tell stories about moral collapse and a future restoration. The similarities are real, but similarity is not proof of a shared origin. Two people on opposite sides of the planet can both build a shelter when it rains. That does not mean they received the blueprint from the same hidden civilization. Two traditions can warn against greed without being fragments of one lost universal religion. Two cultures can imagine destruction followed by renewal because that pattern is visible everywhere in nature. Forests burn and regrow, floods destroy fields and leave new soil. Winter seems to kill the world, then spring returns. The danger begins when we turn broad human patterns into claims of secret coordination. Take the Maya calendar. For years, popular media insisted that the Maya had predicted the end of the world in 2012. Books, films, websites, and television specials turned an important Mesoamerican system of timekeeping into an apocalyptic countdown clock. Then 2012 arrived. The world did not end, and the story revealed something important. The countdown had largely been built by outsiders. Maya calendrical traditions were complex. They involved cycles of time, ritual, history, astronomy, and renewal. The ending of one calendar cycle did not automatically mean the destruction of the planet. But a cycle completes and another begins is less marketable than an ancient civilization predicted doomsday. So the complicated tradition got flattened into a headline. The same thing can happen to Hopi teachings. A line on a rock becomes a timeline. A symbol becomes a prediction of a specific machine, nation, war, or year. Then the timeline is placed next to a Maya date, a biblical verse, a Nostradamus quatrain, and a photograph of a distant galaxy. The differences between cultures disappear. Historical context disappears. Living communities disappear. What remains is a giant mystery machine built to produce one thing: certainty. And certainty is incredibly profitable when people are afraid. Biblical apocalypse is often pulled into these connections too. The book of Revelation contains powerful images: conflict, judgment, beasts, destruction, a transformed world, a final renewal. For many Christians, these texts carry deep spiritual meaning. They have been interpreted in radically different ways across centuries, as messages for persecuted communities in the Roman world, as symbolic visions, as moral warnings, as prophecies of future events, or as some combination of all of those things. But Revelation emerged from a particular religious, political, and historical setting. Hopi traditions emerged from a different land, language, history, and ceremonial life. Putting them together as if they are two chapters from the same coded book may sound expansive. In reality, it can erase both. Then there is Atlantis. The story began with the Greek philosopher Plato, who used Atlantis in dialogues written more than 2,000 years ago. Whether Plato intended it as history, allegory, political warning, or some mixture of those things remains debated. But modern imagination has transformed Atlantis into almost anything people need it to be. A global mother civilization, an advanced technological empire, a source of pyramids, prophecy, sacred geometry, and supposedly hidden wisdom preserved by indigenous peoples. There is no credible evidence that Atlantis was a real worldwide civilization that taught the Hopi, the Maya, the Egyptians, and everyone else the same secret message. Yet the idea persists because it offers a seductive shortcut. It says distinct cultures do not need to be understood on their own terms. Their achievements, stories, and sacred knowledge can all be explained by a lost master civilization. That is not wonder. It is a way of taking history away from real people. And extraterrestrial theories can do something similar. They see a petroglyph, an old story, an unfamiliar symbol, and immediately ask whether it describes visitors from another world. Sometimes the question is framed as admiration. Ancient people were so knowledgeable, so observant, so sophisticated, that surely they must have had outside help. But why is outside help the first explanation? Why not begin with the possibility that people were intelligent, creative, spiritually complex, and fully capable of making meaning from the world around them? Why assume a symbol becomes important only if it points to alien technology rather than human responsibility? The answer is uncomfortable, because mystery can be more exciting than context, and because some people would rather imagine ancient astronauts than do the slower work of learning history. Forced connections do more than create bad theories. They can spread misinformation at astonishing speed. A claim repeated in one best-selling book appears in 10 documentaries. Those documentaries become short videos. The short videos become captions. Soon, a speculation has been copied so many times that it feels established. But repetition is not documentation. A dramatic claim needs a source. A source needs context. Context needs to be checked against language, history, archaeology, and, where appropriate, the voices of the people whose traditions are being discussed. Without that work, we are not uncovering hidden truth. We are building a collage from other people's sacred stories. Still, there is a universal question beneath all this, and it does not need a secret global prophecy to matter. What happens when a society's way of life becomes unsustainable? What happens when people take more from the land than the land can restore? When wealth and power become more important than obligation? When a community knows it is moving toward danger but cannot agree to change direction? That question belongs to no single culture. It belongs to all of us. The Hopi Prophecy Rock does not need to be merged with every apocalypse tradition on Earth to speak to that fear. Its power may be stronger when we resist the urge to make it prove more than the evidence can support. Because the real Crossroads is not hidden in an Atlantis map, a Maya countdown, a biblical code, or a message from the stars. It is much closer than that. It is in the choices societies make when they realize the path they are on cannot continue forever. And that is where the meaning of a warning becomes different from the meaning of a prediction. A prediction says this will happen. A warning says this could happen if nothing changes. That difference is everything. The most enduring prophecy traditions are not always fatalistic. They do not necessarily describe a future locked in place, rolling toward us like a train that cannot be stopped. Many are conditional. They connect consequences to conduct. They ask what happens when people forget obligations, abandon balance, misuse power, or treat the living world as if it exists only to be consumed. That is not the same as saying every detail of every Hopi prophecy interpretation can be translated directly into modern politics, climate science, or personal lifestyle. It cannot. Hopi teachings belong within Hopi communities, lands, languages, ceremonies, and histories. Outsiders should be cautious about turning sacred traditions into a convenient moral poster for the rest of the world. But the question raised by the Prophecy Rock, especially in its modern public interpretation, still lands with enormous force. What if the line is not telling us what must happen? What if it is showing us where certain choices lead? That is a much harder question because it removes the comfort of inevitability. If disaster is inevitable, then nobody is really responsible. You can watch it coming, share a video about it, argue about the date, buy survival supplies, and tell yourself the ending was written long before you arrived. But if the future is shaped by choices, then the burden comes back. Not all at once. Not on one person. Not in some simplistic way where recycling a bottle solves a planetary crisis, or where an individual can personally repair systems built over generations. The problems are structural. They involve governments, industries, infrastructure, laws, wealth, energy, food, water, and power. But structures are maintained by choices too, by what societies reward, by what they tolerate, by what they refuse to see. Think about consumption, not just what we buy, but the deeper story behind buying. A culture can teach people that enough is never enough. A bigger house, a newer device, faster delivery, more extraction hidden behind cleaner packaging. Resources pulled from somewhere else, waste sent somewhere else. Consequences delayed long enough that the person making the purchase never has to watch them arrive. That is one kind of path. Then there is community. Do we know the people around us? Do we build systems where the elderly, the sick, the poor, and the isolated can survive a heat wave, a drought, a fire, a blackout, a flood? Or have we created a world where everyone is expected to face every crisis alone, armed with a phone, a credit card, and a vague feeling that somebody else should have fixed it? Then there is the land. For people in the Southwest, this is not abstract. Water does not respond to political slogans. A reservoir does not fill because a nation refuses to discuss limits. Aquifers can be drained, soil can be exhausted, rivers can be divided on paper until there is less and less water left to divide in reality. The land keeps accounts. It may take years, decades, even generations before the bill comes due. But it keeps accounts, and then there is attention. The resource modern life may be wasting faster than anything else. A warning only matters if people can remain focused long enough to understand it. But outrage moves quickly. Fear moves quickly. Every day brings another headline, another crisis, another prediction, another video insisting that this is the final sign, the last chance, the point of no return. After a while, people stop responding, not because the danger is gone, because they are exhausted. That is the trap of doom scrolling. It feels like paying attention, but often it is the opposite. You absorb an endless stream of catastrophe without gaining context, without learning what is documented, without asking what can actually be done. Fear becomes a performance. Sharing becomes a substitute for responsibility. The future becomes entertainment. The Prophecy Rock can be used that way too. It can become one more image passed around online, with a caption claiming it marks exactly where we are now. One more supposed proof that the end is near. One more reason to stare at the screen and wait for history to happen to us. But maybe that misses its deeper power. Maybe its power lies in making consequences visible before they become unavoidable. A path is not dangerous only when it reaches the cliff. It is dangerous when it has been moving toward the cliff for miles, while everyone keeps walking because the ground beneath their feet still feels solid. That is what warnings do. They reveal direction. They show that the present is not just a collection of disconnected events. A drought, a fire season, a polluted river, a broken community, a widening gap between wealth and poverty, a political system unable to act on known risks. These may look separate, but they can be signs of the same deeper problem. A society losing the ability to live within limits and care for what keeps it alive. And responsibility does not mean despair. Responsibility means refusing both extremes. Refusing the fantasy that nothing is wrong, and refusing the fantasy that nothing can be done. It means asking better questions. What do we take, and what do we restore? What do we build, and who does it protect? What stories teach us to accept endless growth, endless speed, endless distraction? What would it mean to choose enough, not perfection, not purity, not a sudden return to some imagined past? A real change in direction, made through countless decisions by communities, institutions, and individuals who understand that survival is not only about getting through the next disaster, it is about becoming the kind of society that creates fewer disasters in the first place. So perhaps the rock does not offer a sentence handed down from the past. Perhaps it offers a question. When you reach a fork in the road, what does it mean to recognize that you are standing at one? Maybe it means you stop pretending there was never a choice. That is the meaning of the crossroads, not a hidden calendar. Not a code that can be solved by drawing a line from an ancient petroglyph to a specific headline, election, war, eclipse, or technological breakthrough. The Hopi Prophecy Rock has been presented that way countless times. A photograph appears online. Someone points to a branch in the line. Someone else adds a date. Then suddenly the uncertainty disappears, and a complex cultural image becomes a countdown clock. But the evidence does not support that certainty. What can be said, cautiously, is that the image commonly called the Hopi Prophecy Rock became widely known through public presentations of Hopi prophecy, especially in the 20th century. Its familiar symbols, including the central human figure, the line of life and branching paths, have been interpreted as carrying teachings about migration, spiritual obligation, imbalance, destruction, and the possibility of renewal. Those interpretations matter. They have shaped how millions of people understand the image. But the rock does not come with an ancient label explaining every mark in modern English. Petroglyphs are difficult to date precisely. Public versions of the prophecy have passed through translations, retellings, lectures, books, films, activists, spiritual movements, and now social media. And Hopi people themselves are not a single voice with one universally public interpretation of every teaching. That uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is the reason we have to approach it with humility. Because the moment we claim we have decoded an indigenous tradition better than the people whose ancestors carried it, we have stopped listening. We have taken something living, something rooted in place and responsibility, and turned it into an object for our own fear. And fear loves certainty. Fear wants the exact date, the exact catastrophe, the exact sign that proves we were right to panic. But a crossroads does not need an exact date to be real. You can see one in the direction of a river running lower each year. In the heat trapped over expanding cities. In a food system dependent on exhausted soil, cheap fuel, and fragile supply chains. In technologies built faster than laws, ethics, or public understanding can keep up. In communities where people are surrounded by information but separated from one another. In a culture that can calculate almost anything except when enough is enough. The question is not whether an ancient carving predicted every detail of this moment. The question is whether we recognize the pattern. A path away from balance rarely announces itself as evil. It often arrives looking like convenience, efficiency, growth, progress. Just one more mine, one more dam, one more forest cleared, one more system designed to extract value now and leave the cost for somebody else later. That is how consequences work. They accumulate quietly. Then, eventually, they stop being quiet. The deeper message associated with the crossroads is not that humanity is doomed. It is that actions have direction. A society can become more disconnected from land, from one another, from limits, and from the responsibilities that keep life going. Or it can turn, not perfectly, not easily, but deliberately. That is the part that matters most. Humility means admitting we are not outside the web of life. Technology does not make us independent of water. Wealth does not make us independent of soil. Information does not make us wise, and no prediction, ancient or modern, removes our responsibility for the world we are building. Because every generation stands somewhere on the line, and every generation tells itself it has more time. Maybe we do. Maybe we do not. Nobody can honestly point to the Prophecy Rock and prove that it identifies exactly where we are now. But perhaps that was never the point. Perhaps the point is more demanding than a prediction. It asks us to look at the path beneath our feet. It asks us what we are willing to sacrifice for speed, comfort, power, and endless consumption. And it asks a final question that no ancient symbol can answer for us. Which path is modern society actively building? If this story made you think, like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more investigations into history, mystery, and the stories that shape how we see the world. And let us know where you are listening from. The best way to support the channel is to listen on Spotify through the link in the description.